light, where sacred stories illuminate the path of awakening. Today's guest, David Richards, brings a soul stirring narrative from a childhood near that experience to a life shaped by military service, culture exploration, heartbreak, and ultimately spiritual rebirth. In a world where faith is often inherited but rarely questioned, David's transformation reveals what happens when the divine becomes personal and everything else falls away. Welcome to the show, David. It's an honor to have you.
Oh, thank you so much. What a beautiful intro. It's an honor to be here.
Mhm. So, David, let's begin at the beginning. Your near death experience as a child. You floated outside your body. What imprint did that leave on your understanding of life and soul?
What a what a great question. At the time, I didn't really process it. I was only 6 years old, and my best friend threw a hammer. He was in a very angry state, and it knocked me unconscious. And I remember watching his brother carry my body back to their house. But as a 6-year-old, it's very hard to contemplate or process what that means. And so I put that memory out of my life up until the pandemic. And then during the pandemic, I came back to revisit it. And I realized that was a moment of spiritual enlightenment that happened at such an early age and it had a profound effect. And so, in some sense, it was not just a reframing of my understanding of spirituality and the divine, but it was also the realization that I had neglected to address the significance of what that meant for the better part of 45 years or so.
Hmm. Right. And did that experience guide your spiritual path early on, or did it resurface later during your breakdown in 2020?
It really resurfaced later. I think initially after it happened, I put that memory out of my mind, and it was so funny because I realized probably just within the last couple of years that that memory was always there. It was almost like this blind spot in my mind as I went through about my days, and I'd always have this vision of seeing this kind of dark silhouette of this person carrying my body and not really being able to place it. And it wasn't until the pandemic. But at the time it happened, I remember after I got out of the hospital, I just told my friends, oh, the doctor said it missed my brain, even though I had no way of saying whether or not that was true or how I would have known that information. And I think it was in some ways me trying to cover up for whatever that experience might have caused, what impact that might have had on my personality. I couldn't say, obviously, but I tried to make up for it. And then when it came back during the pandemic, it was very much a huge life altering experience just because there were so many of those things happening during the pandemic that led me to kind of my own spiritual transformation. And it was, I think in modern parlance, it's called the dark night of the soul, or it's really, I think, the transformational fire of almost this divine baptism where you contemplate, is there a greater consciousness at work in the universe? And if so, what is it like to encounter that in a direct fashion?
Yeah, many people dismiss early trauma or mystical moments until life brings them full circle. And your story seems to whisper that nothing is ever truly forgotten.
It's very true. It's so true. And I think it's timely too, in that as the pandemic was beginning, I was just releasing my second book. And my second book was actually born out of my practice as a yoga instructor. And the idea behind the book was that your mind is an ocean, and that's where all your memories, all your experiences reside, and your awareness, so where you place your attention, is a lighthouse. And so the premise of the book is that this young man doesn't want to inherit his father's life, and so decides to go become a lighthouse keeper's apprentice on this kind of magical, mystical lighthouse. And it was kind of as I finished that book and was launching it for publication right when the pandemic happened, that all these events started to happen. And I think it's, for me, I've always been a lifelong seeker of the truth, even though it didn't always show up in how I was living my life. And yet, we're all, I think you mentioned it in the intro, is that we all have a framework for what we believe. And much of that is inherited before it's ever chosen. Depending on what culture you grew up in, you are going to inherit a set of beliefs that come from your family, from your culture, from the region of the world in which you grew up. And it's only through life's experience that you start to question those or either invalidate them or validate them. But that process of awakening is the invalidation or validation of beliefs, because as you go through the journey, you realize if there is a greater truth, it it most likely defies religion, because religion is just a box or an instrument in which we try to contemplate infinite intelligence, and every religion does it a little bit differently. So when you have that real encounter, it comes down to what does it mean to embody that level of awareness within inside yourself. And once you realize if I'm capable of doing that, then anyone's capable of doing that. And that is when true awakening happens, because then you start to see the oneness in the world that is, I think, very common in some of the more um and less so in monotheism. Like you don't hear necessarily a lot of oneness in Judaism or Christianity or Islam. Certainly as a yoga instructor, the idea, I mean, yoga means unity. And so there's this idea of oneness that's very prevalent in that practice.
Mm-hmm. 100%. And you were raised in a military Christian household, but also deeply influenced by Eastern cultures. How did that cultural contrast shape your beliefs about love, faith, and the divine?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So when I was 10 years old, my father was in the military. And when I was 10 years old, we moved to the island of Okinawa, Japan, and we lived there for 3 years. Now, obviously, that is a very different cultural experience than growing up exclusively in the United States, like a lot of my classmates did at the time. And just one, not only just seeing the age of Japanese culture, I grew up, I mean, the United States here in 2 weeks or so, we'll celebrate our 250th birthday, which is quite a milestone. And yet, Japanese culture, Indian culture, different cultures go back thousands of years. I mean, there are churches in Europe that are older than the United States is as a country. So going into Japan and seeing not just the history of the culture and the richness, kid, I certainly loved. Their toys were so much better than ours. Their cartoons were more vivid and more powerful. But culturally, when you look at like the samurai or the ninja as a kid, those things really resonate with you because um, they're kind of fantastical stories. At the same time, they have the samurai had a code of honor. Bushido was the code of the samurai, and it was very much about the idea that one's life is in service of the emperor and that your life is basically meaningless without sacrifice and willingness to die on behalf of the emperor and Japan. And so there was, I think, one of the to contrast that growing up in the Judeo-Western Christianity, Judeo-Christian upbringing, there's a lot of emphasis on the Bible, the stories in the Bible. There's less emphasis on how do you embody that? How do you take the teachings of Jesus or any other of the Moses or someone else, and how do you embody that into your being so you become part of it? And that's obviously yoga does a really great job of that. So spending 3 years in Japan and then coming back to the United States, the one thing that I had this keen sense of awareness of, and it was probably born from the fact of this experience where had this near death experience when I was 6, was the idea that I wasn't completely present. Like I had this sense that I wasn't completely fully present in the moment. And so that led me to take up meditation when I was probably just 13 years old. And it was obviously very clumsy and it was kind of a clunky experience, but I read this book and it was the idea that you just sit still and you clear all your thoughts out of your mind. And then when you do that, suddenly a thought pops in and you're kind of like, oh, where did that thoughts come from? That's so interesting. And so that was my first kind of immersion or attempt to immerse myself in the world of meditation and finding the sense of inner stillness. And obviously, I grew up in the 1980s here in the United States. That was not a popular cultural thing to do as a teenager going through high school. And so I was something of an oddball going up through high school, but that practice stayed with me even as I got into the military.
That's great. And did you ever feel torn between obedience and intuition in your spiritual journey?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's a huge, I think part of it is in the West, particularly with the way Christianity has been practiced in the United States, there was such an emphasis, for example, on the Ten Commandments. And even today, I just saw something a few weeks back where in Texas, they want to put the Ten Commandments in schools. So they're showing up in schools. And I admire and appreciate the perspective of doing that, but you have to look at it in the context of the entire biblical story. And the Ten Commandments were given to Moses 3,500 years ago. And they're all written, or I shouldn't say all of them, but about 80% of them are written in negative language. Well, what's the problem with negative language? If I tell you in this moment right now, whatever you do, don't think of a pink elephant, the chances are you just thought of a pink elephant because, and it's called negation blindness. And so the laws passed down to Moses were intentionally strict. Well, when you're focusing on what you're not supposed to do, what are the odds that you're going to keep doing it or do it in the first place because you're focusing on something? It's like if I don't want to focus on crashing into a telephone pole and I keep staring at the telephone pole, I'm 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 guaranteeing myself that that's what's going to happen because where you place your attention is where you place your awareness and your energy. And so in that sense, when you lead with that sort of upbringing, and that's part of your cultural upbringing to focus on the things you're not supposed to do, you gravitate towards those things. And there is a sense that if I do something wrong, yes, I know I've done something wrong, but it's because of the inherent tendency to focus on those things that you can't prevent them from happening. And the spiritual sense of oneness, there is an altruism. And I think there's a more, even I think if you look at Brahma in Indian culture, it's kind of the Godhead. But there's an idea that there is an internal sense of true north, if you will, an internal compass to our being, and that our actions are often oriented around that sense of what we believe to be right and wrong. And so, very often, especially as I was growing up, and I realized the orientation that I had, which I felt was very noble, was so out of place with my environment. In other words, the people, like when I went to high school, I didn't want to drink. I didn't want to like mess around with girls because I thought those things were bad, but that's what everyone was doing. And so gradually there's this erosion of the moral high ground kind of, and you're like, well, okay, I'm going to do these things. And then there's kind of an awakening or a reckoning that, okay, I drank or I went out with someone or whatever the case may be. And then there's this this internal reconciliation where you either try to justify to make yourself feel better, or you realize, oh, I did something that I shouldn't have done, whatever the case may be. So I think there's always this internal sense of navigation. Are you aiming towards the highest good, or are you aiming towards something that's more self motivated? And motive does matter, right? That's one of the big lessons I've taken away from my time in the Tony Robbins community over the past 8 years is motive absolutely matters. And so if you have a sense that a if there is a divine entity, like I said, I'll call it the logos, because I think that is in Christian context, in the ancient Greek, logos means the divine order of creation and reason. So it's like this principal architect of thought, really. And if you align towards that, then you're going to respond internally to that sense of rightness, that sense of absolute rightness. If you, on the other hand, if you're aligned towards an internal thought about, well, I want to get what's good for me, or I want to take advantage of this situation because it's going to benefit me, you'll be attended to by those thoughts as well. So it really talks to an internal sense of discipline. I think the challenge for any of us is how do you it's the realization that the internal world, the internal state of being then is cast out and reflected in the external world. And so if you don't think there is an internal world that you have to navigate or orient to, you're going to become a slave to the world outside of you. And that's the world of the physical senses, right? So that's why people do drugs or alcohol, or they compulsive shop, or they chase after the opposite sex. It's those kind of things. So absolutely, I think I certainly had that experience growing up, and it was something that I'd learned to discipline. And that, I mean, that discipline took some time, but there's an apparatus within us that allows us to focus on the highest good. And once we recognize that there is a truth in that highest good, we can condition ourselves to that's how we operate normally.
Right. And the tension between structured belief systems and lived soulful truth is something many wrestle with. And your story embodies that beautifully.
Ah, thank you. I appreciate that. It's I. It's funny because it wasn't. I. For me, the bane of my existence, so to speak, was at a very early, a young age. I had this belief that a woman was somehow going to reconnect me to God. And again, this is obviously all from within the construct of the Judeo-Christian upbringing. Um, but it was this very sort of romantic idea, and it was. I mean, at the time I had it, it was. I could watch something like Snow White or Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty from Disney, and I was kind of like, oh, that's the kind of love that's out there. Like, that's the kind of love that I'm going to find. It's going to be really beautiful. And I went through lots of relationships, and that didn't materialize. And then in the first month of the pandemic, I saw this image of a woman online that instantly gave me the sense of deja vu. And I was working on my third book, and it wasn't going to be anything what it turned out to be. But I said, I'm going to write a story about this picture. This picture has inspired me to write a story. And that journey took me basically 2.5 years to complete. So I didn't realize kind of what I was getting myself into. But in some ways, it is the hero's journey. And that's what I've really come to espouse and believe is whatever anyone believes about life and eternity or what comes after, you get to reconcile that within inside yourself. And in the Judeo-Christian context, obviously there is a very prescriptive path on what that looks like. And that's kind of the hero's journey. And the hero's journey isn't just something that I came up with. It's every Hollywood movie uses the framework of the hero's journey, whether it's Star Wars, Iron Man, Superman, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, they all have the same structure about them. And in some sense, all of them are then a reflection of the archetype of Christ as the ultimate hero's journey, because um, I think there are certain schools of thought that believe his story is the perfect hero's journey and that it can't really be topped. Um, to experience that personally and viscerally, to go on your own hero's journey, it is absolutely terrifying in some sense, because in one sense you realize the reconciliation of what I believe is completely and 100% up to me. I can't outsource this to someone else. I can't rely on the president. I can't rely on my religious leader. I can't rely on a family member. It's all on me. And at the same time, that becomes this moment of pure exhilaration, because you also realize it is up to me. And it's up to me that I get to create my beliefs and find and embody my beliefs to the greatest extent possible internally. And so, how do I create that sense of internal worth of divinity? And that is a very elegant and beautiful process, because it's almost like, if you look at Thomas Edison, took 7,000 different substances before he invented the light bulb. And so every one of those had to go through its own process of evaluation and validation before he got to a certain point where he realized this isn't it. And so when he realized it's not it, then he has to start from scratch. He takes the next one, and that goes on and on and on. In a similar sense, that's what the hero's journey is. It's almost like a video game where you have to figure out how do I get past this boss level to get to the next level. And when you can apply some sort of framework like that to your life and realize there is a destination of greater value and greater significance and greater transcendence, then it helps you get aligned and get focused.
Definitely. And you mentioned failed marriages and emotional wreckage. How did heartbreak serve as a teacher on your path to unshakable faith?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It was so funny because I feel like I mean, I started writing poetry to girls when I was probably 6 or 7. And I remember had my like first pang of, you know, love that wasn't returned when I was 10 because I wrote this girl poems and she thought I was out, out of, crazy or something. And, but I just had this sense, well, love is certainly the answer. And so I would kind of throw myself with reckless abandon into these relationships. And I thought that I was bringing all of me into the relationship. And what I was really doing was I was kind of surrendering myself to the relationship to try and be what I thought this person wanted or needed in their life. And as the honeymoon phase of the relationship would end, I would come back into the relationship and I realized, oh, this isn't what I want at all. And so it was also kind of bound by what I said earlier about this idea that somehow a woman is going to bring me back to God in some deeply significant way. Um, and so I remember after my first failed marriage, it was somewhat devastating because I thought um, it was kind of like my kingdom had come falling down around my shoulders. Like what? I thought this was going to be it. I thought like I was going to have this honeymoon life based on this relationship, and it wasn't that way at all. And And so then the next time I went into a relationship, I committed to bring more of myself. And then I got married again and the same thing happened. And that marriage lasted longer, but it's like, this is not what I'm looking for. And finally I got to a point where around 2016, I thought, well, you know what, maybe that childhood dream was wrong. Maybe, maybe, maybe there isn't anything divine. Maybe there isn't anything greater. And so I said, I don't know that I consciously did this, but I met someone who didn't have a faith practice. They didn't believe there was something higher. They just thought kind of the basic materialistic view that this life is all there is. And so I thought, well, let me try this out. And we had a really great relationship. And then about 6 months in, I was kind of like, oh, this isn't it either. And yet, instead of ending that relationship like had been my pattern before, I decided I'm going to stay and really see what this is. And that relationship lasted 3.5 years. But in that time, I came to realize the best thing that we can do in this relationship is end it. And it wasn't not because it wasn't it, but because I couldn't fully commit to it on the scale that I believed I needed to. And so in some sense, I had this, in fact, I just wrote about this in the blog yesterday. I had this as the relationship ended right at the end of 2019. So before the pandemic was really making headlines, but I had this great sense of loss because it was the best relationship in terms of how well we got along. And yet, in that sense, I was at the lowest point in my life because I was just like, okay, here we go again. I'm starting over again. But I also, because I had this sense of truth, I had the sense that I was uncovering my truth by taking accountability for my life, that I had just this unbelievable sense of optimism. I'm like, this is like, what is this little spark of joy within me? And then as the pandemic started, it was, in one sense, it was almost spectacular because I thought, okay, well, this will give me time to really get my life oriented and fixed because I haven't really processed any of the past trauma that I put myself through with these failed relationships over the past, 10 years or 15 years. I'm working on my next book. And then I had these magical or miraculous experiences that started happening. And I saw this woman. And as soon as I saw that woman, I had the appreciation within about 30 seconds that this image of this woman was what I'd been looking for my entire life. And just the idea that I was going to turn it into a story seemed so simple at first. And then I went through the journey. But I think the Persian poet Rumi has a beautiful quote, and he says, "You have to keep breaking your heart until it opens." And I realized it took me, 30 years of breaking my heart before it really opened. And then it opened during the pandemic, and that's what transformed me.
It's beautiful. And was faith something that emerged organically from that pain, or did you have to actively seek it?
It's a great question. I think, and I would say when I first, the faith was a reconciliation with God. And I say it in that sense because the idea of God can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. In fact, the origin of the word God is German in nature, and it came from the word Gudan, which means to invoke or to call into power. And I say that because then if you take it from those two definitions, God isn't a noun, it's a verb. And so it's kind of what you say with your voice. And so as I had these heartbreaks and setbacks in my life, I wanted to reconcile myself with God, but to truly understand the Christian narrative, the path towards reconciliation is Jesus. And that's a very distinct and yet critical understanding to make, is that there is a clear line of reconciliation through the biblical narrative, provided you understand it. And even as so I didn't have that sense of reconciliation. And part of it was because the actions that led me to these failed marriages or any other failed setbacks in my life were so self-induced. And so I had this overwhelming sense of shame. And I was like, I don't want to, there was almost this blindness towards trying to reconcile my life through the story of Jesus. And then when all these things happened during really the first 2 months of the pandemic, I was beside myself because I was like, oh my gosh, this is all coming together. This all makes so much sense. And for me, Jesus was a part of the story, but my faith in him was obscured because I was focused on this woman and all the beauty and meaning that I saw in this image of her, and then trying to extract that meaning out. And so then faith really was learned because I had to, like, I talk about being raised from a Judeo Christian perspective, but I didn't go to church for 30 years. Like, I would go at Christmas or Easter because those are the two big milestone events around Jesus' life and resurrection. But I wasn't practicing the faith in that sense. And it was because I was looking for this woman. And so when I found the woman, then it was like, okay, well, what does it mean to have faith? How do you have faith? What does that look like? How do you internalize that? And that was much like the Edison comment I made earlier. There was a lot of trial and error in that. And then it's, okay, well, what does it mean to have faith? And in some sense, it's belief in something that you can't yet see. And how do you bring that to life? And I go back to Thomas Edison. He had this idea that he could create light that didn't require flame or gas. And after 7,000 attempts, he made it. And for me, it was a lot of how do I bring this story out of me? And that was the practice of faith, because then it is, if in the Judeo-Christian context, if Christ is the path to salvation, is how do you foster that relationship? And to pull it from the idea that I shared with earlier, that if you can align the voice of conscience within you, depending on how you assign meaning to that voice, can either be the highest good, which conceivably in a human form would be Jesus, or it can be something else based on what your motive is. But if you can say, okay, well, I'm going to look at that as the voice of Jesus, then my voice of conscience becomes altruistic in that sense, because I know Jesus would not harm other people or do something that betrays or violates someone else's trust or sovereignty. And so then it's a discipline of, okay, how do I cultivate that sense of oneness, that inner sense of oneness, based on my perception of the highest good, and then how do I make the voice of my conscience that highest good? And that to me is some of the mechanism behind the internal act of developing faith.
So often, the spiritual journey is not born not in joy but in grief. And your ability to extract that grace from suffering is deeply powerful.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And it's so true. I mean, you look at a lot of famous stories, Oprah Winfrey was sexually abused. So she had trauma in her life, and then she built this empire. Sylvester Stallone, the famous actor, had to sell his dog so he could get food to live. And then he launched the film Rocky. So and it's a very distinct truth. And I mean, part of that fact is, to meet the divine, however you label it, and I'll extract it from the Judeo-Christian construct, but to meet the divine in some ways is through suffering, because it's oftentimes at our lowest points where we've realized that the path that we've taken has gotten us to where we are. And it's then the reliance on, or the belief in something greater than us, that ultimately pulls us out into our own greatness.
Absolutely. And David Richards reminds us that faith is not inherited, it's uncovered, sometimes through pain, sometimes through silence, but always through grace. His journey from outer discipline to inner surrender is an invitation to us all to let go of who we thought we were and listen to who we truly are. If you're in a moment of doubt, perhaps it's just the beginning of your divine remembrance.